Welcome to episode 171 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm talking about Isaac Hayes' second album as a solo artist from 1969, Hot Buttered Soul. And this is the first Canadian pressing of that particular release. It says Enterprise Records on the top, which was kind of a subsidiary label of Stax, but the labels on the records actually say Stax, so Stax it is. He was born in Covington, Tennessee in 1942. His parents were sharecroppers, which is a term we throw around, but basically sharecropping was the post-Civil War Reconstruction era system of land use where plantation owners were not forced to redistribute their land to people they'd been exploiting for 2 centuries. Instead, former slaves were allowed to stay on the land and farm the land in exchange for giving the plantation owners some of their crop. The social structure of slavery largely intact. Anyway, this is the world into which Hayes is born in 1942. His life had a terrible beginning to it. By the time he was 18 months, his mother had died and his dad had taken off, so he ends up being raised by his mom's parents. The family moves to Memphis, and that's where his musical abilities really begin to take off because he's fortunate enough to go to Manassas High School, where the main music teacher is a guy called Emerson Abel, who influenced generations of students going through that particular musical program. He also, and this would be fortuitous for Hayes, played sax with an outfit called the Ben Branch Band. Hayes continues to develop his musical proficiency and his singing while he's in high school. He wins a talent contest while he's still in high school. He also begins to hang out underage at some of the clubs in North Memphis where so many of the great bands that play the Chitlin circuit would come through. Around this time, in 1961, there's a bit of a watershed development. Hayes sneaks into a club called Curry's Club Tropicana in the north part of Memphis, and the aforementioned Ben Branch Band, who had a kind of a regional profile, were playing. And the band members persuade Ben Branch to let Hayes get up and sing a song. Some debate as to which song it is, but he's a big hit, and out of that he gets a regular gig 3 nights a week with the Ben Branch Band. He begins to get quite a reputation, Memphis of course being a well-connected music town to say the least, and when he leaves high school he's got a number of offers for scholarships to go to study music at different colleges. He's also getting lots of gigs still, and he turns down the scholarship so he can continue to make money for his family and provide for him because, of course, his grandparents had raised him. He records 1 or 2 singles that really don't do anything at all. His big break, however, comes in 1964 when he's invited by Stax Records to come in and cut an instrumental as a replacement for a member of their regular in-house band. Now, before the Bar-Kays, the in-house band at Stax was Booker T and the MGs, and these guys were already huge names because they'd had a big hit in 1962 with Green Onions. Booker T, of course, is a very accomplished musician. He was studying classical composition at the time at Indiana University while he was doing session work for Stax. Hayes was asked to come in and fill in, and that's how he becomes a regular session guy at Stax. His first recording session at Stax was for an Otis Redding album, Otis Blue, which comes out in '65. But the key development here when he's at Stax finally is that he forms this great songwriting partnership with a guy called David Porter. Hayes and Porter turn out all kinds of hits in the mid-'60s, particularly for the singing group Sam and Dave. At Stax, Hayes gets all kinds of production work as well, particularly with Sam and Dave, but also with other artists. So by this point, 1967 or so, he's a multi-instrumentalist. He's a very successful songwriter. He knows the production side of the studio inside and out, and he's really getting a great sense of the whole music business. In 1968, he's got enough jam with the label to be able to release a solo album presenting Isaac Hayes, which, as Wikipedia calls it, is a jazzy, largely improvised effort which is commercially unsuccessful. It's kind of hard to disagree with that assessment. But all of that information and all of that skill and all of that knowledge and expertise he'd gathered in the previous few years was about to come in handy because hard times were about to hit the label. In the last year, they've lost all their back catalog due to a corporate split with Atlantic Records. They've also tragically lost Otis Redding, their leading artist, and most of their in-house backing band who played on the albums and singles of pretty much all their artists, the Bar-Kays, in the same plane crash. So the label's really up against it. So what they do is they ask all their established remaining talent to get going, making records, and they ask some of their leading talent like Isaac Hayes and Steve Cropper and others to put out their own solo records, even though Hayes' previous solo album had been a total disaster. So Hayes has the walnuts to say to Bell, I'll do it, but I want total creative control. And Bell agrees, and so Hayes goes into the studio to record this absolutely wild album, which ends up being a massive success. The basic tracks for this album were laid down in Ardent Studios in Memphis, and they're produced by Al Bell, whom I just mentioned, along with Alan Jones and Marvell Thomas. The band for these original sessions are the Bar-Kays, now reconstituted, and they include Willie Hall on drums, James Alexander on bass, and Michael Tolles on guitar. Marvell Thomas, who's the co-producer, plays piano, and Hayes plays Hammond organ and sings, and at the same time, while he's singing the vocals live, he's also conducting all the other players. The last player of note on these original sessions is a guy called Harold Bean, who plays guitar on the opening track, Walk On By. There's a second round of production done in Detroit after the Memphis sessions at United Sound Studios and Terra Shurma Studios, and that's where the distinctive horns and string arrangements are done, and those are arranged by a guy called Johnny Allen. Hayes had really given no thought to the commercial viability of the record, but nonetheless, it begins to get some late night radio play. He's the beneficiary of FM radio, just starting to come into its own at the time. And on the strength of that, the label decides to release two edited down versions of Walk On By. And by the time we get to Phoenix, and those take off, and this album sells 1 million copies. It goes to #1 on the R&B charts. It also goes to #1 on the jazz charts, in the process upsetting some white guys in black turtlenecks who maybe thought that jazz was taking a wrong turn, but that's neither here nor there. Side 1 starts with a tidy little 12-minute track called Walk On By, which is written by Burt Bacharach and had previously been made famous by Dionne Warwick. I think there are some real highs and lows to this song. The horn and string arrangement is amazing. It is, without in any way seeming overdone, lush enough and grand enough almost to be the soundtrack to a John Ford Western. I think the downside, and I can see this may be a minority view, is that guitar solo, which I find super twangy, super trebly, and above all, super long. The next song is a nearly impossible to pronounce hyperbolic syllabic sesquidale mystic, which comes in at 9 minutes 55 seconds. This is Hayes' sole self-penned song on the whole record. Is it a love song? Is it about heroin? Is it about both? I don't know, but I think it's actually the real highlight of this disc. It's absolutely full of hooks, in particular that wonderful little wah-wah guitar riff, which just repeats. There's a power of repetition in this song, which Hayes just locks into and completely justifies whatever length he wants to make this one. The instrumental break on this is Butter. The bass playing by James Alexander is just great all the way through. There's this wonderful little laid-back piano solo by Hayes towards the end. He knows when to stop, and it's just rich and delicious, this whole song. Side 2 starts with One Woman, which is really the only truly conventional song on the whole record. It's a tough sell ethically. I mean, this is a song, again, about an affair that the guy just can't quit, despite the fact that he's married. He's got this classic lyric, one woman's making my home while the other woman's making me do wrong. However, despite this, Hayes really does sell the lyric. He really does sell the genuine feeling of the song. I guess probably having some degree of experience, having been married 4 times, or ultimately would be, and ultimately fathering 14 kids. He may know some of the aspects of this more intimately than others. The last song on the album, and really one of the great pinnacles of musical excess, Pièce de Résistance, is By the Time I Get to Phoenix, which was written by Jimmy Webb but had been made famous by Glen Campbell. It starts off with this slow pulse from the rhythm section with this one chord on the organ, which lasts and lasts and lasts and lasts. There's a little tiny break where I think maybe Isaac's fingers got tired and he had to sort of reset. But otherwise, for 8.5 minutes or so, this one chord plays and he raps over top. I do think, and I don't want to second guess the great man too much, but I think a bass riff might have been a little bit preferable to that single organ chord, just in terms of helping the listener get through that period. When the strings come in, it's kind of a magical moment, I think, because you've been waiting and waiting for something to happen, and when they do, it's kind of a release. You have to recall, of course, while listening to this, that Isaac is actually conducting the rest of the band as he's singing, as he's playing the organ. And the Bar-Kays, he brings them to this kind of crescendo, and then the very last stanza, he sort of brings it all down, to kind of get to the resolution of the song. And then Hayes gives us this organ solo, quite a famous organ solo, which is like a celebration or an emotional rebirth, like a phoenix from the ashes. It's really pretty cool. And that wraps up the record. Hayes had very little name recognition at the time. His only other solo album, the year before, had totally tanked. Given any kind of rational decision making, there was no way he should have approached this record as he did, certainly not in the interest of the label. This is kind of like the Stones deciding to release Tales from Topographic Oceans as their second LP. But somehow it works. Soul music, and arguably pop music more generally, were never really quite the same after this in terms of what was possible. It's got some pretty significant flaws, but also has some pretty amazing highs, and it is a remarkable piece of experimentation, and I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.